While you come up to the stage, I'm happy to introduce you. Dr. Jennifer Clarke is an artist and anthropologist and works as associate professor at the Gray School of Art of the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen. Her research in Japan and in UK is situated between visual culture, anthropology, and artistic research, and is developed through multimodal and practice-based methods, such as moving image, exhibition making, and artistic publication. One strand of her work focuses on parasitic methodologies and what she names visceral ecologies, through which she looks at how environmental knowledge is internalized, transformed, and lived through everyday material practices, such as making, storing, handling, and sensing. I think that's bold. I think what we can see this movement now towards the artistic practice, which was already hinted before, and I would like it to be a bit the underground line of the stream and the panel, and very much, again, issues of opacity and invisibility. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I want to say, I'm okay, actually, thank you. I want to say thank you, first of all, to Jakob and his co-curator and offerer of hospitality, to Chiara. You know, it was difficult for me to be here, but I'm just so glad to have been able to participate, I felt very engaged yesterday. And this morning I rewrote my paper after yesterday, and I think I probably could have rewritten it again this afternoon. I kind of have. Partly because I did a whole series of exhibitions called Invisible Matters about 10 years ago about my work. I promised in the abstract some work around environment and ecology, and I think that's a conversation we could open further at some point. So I also want to thank Michael for addressing some of those more than human and non-human politics. And I also want to apologize for the absence of the visceral, but it's here and everywhere in the room and in my work. Most of the images I'm going to show today are not necessarily ones I've exhibited. There's one image of an exhibition at the end, but I might not get there. So I work between anthropology and art. My doctoral thesis is called Working Between Anthropology and Working Between Art and Forestry. And much of my practice is about collaboration as well as through collaboration and image making in the context of climate and environmental politics, through anthropological as well as artistic practices. And I guess I became connected to this project because I've been writing about the figure of the parasite for some time. And I want to thank Michael again for not having to explain too much of the theory, because that's embedded here somewhere. But it's surfaced in essays, lecture performances, films. Oh, just click. Photographs, different projects. And so returning to these ideas today, I'm not really going to try to define it, but perhaps just ask myself, why it's been useful for so long, what this figure has been doing for me. And many discussions like yesterday of being a parasite or parasitism begin with disruption and intervention and critique. And those concerns are present in my work, but when I look back across the projects that have occupied me for the last decade or two, I find myself arriving somewhere slightly different. And so this version of this paper addresses questions of relation through ideas of translation and perhaps collaboration. But really it's about the ways in which I work alongside others and with images, paying attention to and revealing the politics of technologies and ecologies. Yeah, so I've got 15 minutes here to reflect on these themes, and I wanted to begin with actually how I came to the para-hyphen site, which was through this anthropologist who's in the States called George Marcus. And this phrase, which I'm not really over yet, is this idea that the para-hyphen site always involves a material dimension, a kind of labor, or a making of things out of the way that they are supposedly or otherwise given. And I love the vagaries there and the abstraction about what it means to make things out of things the way they are supposedly or otherwise given, simultaneously addressing the active creation of a field of inquiry. So that's what the parasite might be for him. And I came to this work in the context of thinking, as a researcher, coming to anthropology with an arts background, what does it mean to, as anthropology does often, speak for others? It happens also in the politics of activism and all of the fields we've been discussing today. And I have this insistence on this notion of width and attention to the idea of not intending to parasite others in order to make my own way in the world. And so I guess that was how I began. And I think that's an important framing. Yeah. So unsettling these ideas of autonomy. And on the plane yesterday, thinking about the parasite and returning to these ideas about, why I'm quite obsessed by a space, or as we discussed earlier, a gap where productive things can become possible in a space of misunderstanding. I was reminded of a moment. I first moved to Japan in 2003, and I found myself 23 or 4 years old, in a really warm room like we're in today, but wearing a suit and with another microphone in my hand, like this one. And at some point, I mentioned my mother. And I remember this sudden tingle of awareness of language that's like shame or embarrassment, but not exactly. And I don't really remember the details of that day, but the feeling that remains is that the meanings that I had assumed to exist were suddenly quite close together. Okasan and Okasan, volcano and mountain, they occupy neighboring territories. And even now, I'm not sure what remains as a linguistic memory, but it's rather a bodily one. And it contains some of the questions that occupy me around the notion of translation and mistranslation, of signs and what's really a movement of meaning between people and places. Perhaps someone might recognize the sign on the helmet is from Texas, and Fukuoka, where I lived, has a big presence of the American military occupying a space, and indeed a very positive influence, as some of my Japanese older friends would describe it as. And this recognition that as we communicate, we're not necessarily always transmitting what we intend or understanding what we intend. My point is that sometimes the space of translation, of mistranslation or misunderstanding, reveals assumptions that otherwise might remain invisible, or indeed generate entirely new relations. And I guess this memory repeated itself in my body because I'm interested in how we begin to alter the relations between the observer and the observed. And the ways in which, when we do what we call research, we're often, in whatever field, depending on forms of translation, not just across language, and as I've been experiencing here in Berlin with all of these multiplicities, but also translations between images and texts, cross-cultural transformations, and really ultimately negotiating through partialness and partial understandings, moving between worlds. This is a still from a film I made called Speculative Fiction, Practicing Collectively, and I threw the slide in there because I wanted to highlight that. And now I don't have to talk too much about Sir, but I am interested in these questions that were raised earlier around asymmetry, autonomy and heteronomy, and so on. I want to just highlight that in the next couple of slides, there are references to both something that someone else mentioned, becoming pregnant and hosting another child, a body, and sometimes the loss of those bodies. And so that's referred to here. And for me, they're quite an important part of my thinking with the parasite. Not because this explains what the parasite might be, and certainly not because the parasite explains them, but rather that we bring questions of relation into a different register. We bring questions of dependency and this popular notion of interdependency, forms of exchange and transformation that somehow become impossible to keep at a distance. Where does one body end and another begin? Not a metaphor, not an answer, a way of remaining with relations that are intimate, that are asymmetrical, that are usually unresolved. Who feeds whom? Who sustains whom? It's not a creature. It is also, for Sir, a noise. And I love that, this sense of static or interruption. And I'll get to that in a moment. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. But the parasite is an interruption in a system of communication. A third term that enters the exchange and changes its conditions. But I don't write about Sir's text. I'm interested in working with it, or I was, and I created a series of lecture performances in which I read passages aloud from this book, The Parasite, and to recall some of our fascination with the PowerPoint. This was through COVID. I had a baby. I was doing projects that ended up being in this weird technical relationality that we call Zoom communications, and translating across languages, across images. And in my work, I'm interested in the way in which machine learning and other softwares generate transcripts, describe images, attempt to convert the complexities of our speech and our communication forms into some kind of text, and sometimes text into other forms of text. And I love these spaces where we mishear and sentences drift, things that look like glitches and technical errors. I think offered me and invited an interest for me into the way these errors expose this work, this labor of communication, but also participating in the production of our experience. And the performances became places where multiple relations met. So Sir's writing, machine translation, different images, grief, care, and just the everyday interruptions of domestic life that began to form and inform my work and my practice. And looking back, I think this is the moment when the parasite wasn't a concept that helped me understand my relation as a researcher in another context and my ethical quandaries about what I was doing, but rather a real way of working, a method. But it's not a method for explaining the world, but remaining attentive to these transformations that occur. The mouth is the organ of the parasite. Its polyvalence is admirable. It is used for eating, speaking, yelling, singing, burping, hiccuping, gargling. Everything is there where it belongs, and nothing is forgotten. I'd like to point out that I'm reading off a page that is several pages ahead of the slides that are here. We'll see how we get on. The parasite is no longer a disturbance within a singular system. It becomes a way of thinking, being, about relations, how they're formed, how they're sustained, in what happens between things, between languages, between images and words, between anthropology and art, between people who don't fully understand each other. Thinking about that space not as absence, but as presence, and I wrote this yesterday actually, but not as a gap to be overcome. What if the relation isn't secondary to the things it connects? What if the relation is the thing? Not attachment as harmony, beyond ideas of autonomy or self-sufficiency, towards much more complicated forms of attachment. Attachment as a condition of living with others, as a condition shaped by dependencies, by exchanges. Oh. Grief, love. These are not transparent experiences. They exceed what might be fully represented. A concern with partial visibility shapes the visual language of my work. Faces and things become obscured. Certain details emerge while others disappear. How do I acknowledge that other people are not entirely available to me, that I don't understand? How do I resist the assumption that understanding requires complete access? The parasite reminds us that relations are not symmetrical. Perhaps there is always something that we can't fully know, that remains opaque, that exceeds our grasp, that remains within complexity. Perhaps this is what the parasite continues to offer me. Not just a disturbance in the system. How are relations composed? How are relations sustained? How do we share intimacies through forms and acts of revealing and concealing ourselves and others? Thank you.